the Smart Cities training series that we're organizing from the Global Centre for Technology, Innovation and Sustainable Development here in Singapore. This is an open webinar to all the community of people that are interested in circular economy. But we see that we have a lot of colleagues from UNDP network and also a lot of people that are participating from outside the organization. So welcome all of you, and we hope that you will find the webinar interesting and that it will be useful for you. So just let me walk you through the agenda for today. I will be introducing you the Global Centre here in Singapore and explaining a little bit the objective of this webinar series. Then Tamara Streefland from Metabolic firm will be explaining you several insights and on how to make circular economy in a smart city, how to approach circular economy in cities. And after Tamara, Geoffrey from UNDP Kenya country office will be explaining their experience working in waste management and circular economy in Kenya. And finally, we will have questions and answers time of around 20 minutes for all the questions that you might have. You can write your questions and answers in the bottom below Q&A, and at the end we will be selecting some of the questions and be answering as many as we can. So just to introduce you a little bit the center and the agency. As you know, UNDP is the United Nations Development Program. It's a network, has a network of 170 country offices that work closely with national governments, local authorities, and local stakeholders in the implementation of policies. And within the UNDP, there are 5 global centers that are centers very specialized in specific domains and that work closely with country offices on very specific projects. So the Global Centre here in Singapore, the only center specialized in technology, innovation for the policies and for the sustainable development. So from the center, we work in three main focus areas. So one is sustainable and digital agriculture, digitalization and smart cities, and then sustainable and digital finance. Today we're just going to address digitalization and smart cities, and the webinar falls within this work program. So why are smart cities important, or why do we think that it's important to discuss the role of technology and innovation in cities? First, well, it's a very large question and there can be many answers and discussions about that, but we believe that it's important first for the big challenges that cities face nowadays and how technology can help really tackle these challenges, and not just technology, but also in innovative practices and methodologies. Also for the potential of this innovation and technology, digital technologies, in improving the quality of services that the governments give to the citizens, other services that might be created now, and at the end improving the quality of life of populations. Another reason is because of all the potential of these technologies to generate economic growth and to provide opportunities to local communities and particularly to youth. And finally, for the advantages to live in a globalized world in which we can learn and adopt technologies and practices from other countries. We can learn from other people and other experiences and adapt these innovations or technologies to local countries. So we have the potential to have a lot of information to adapt to our necessities. So how do we work in the domain of smart cities from the center? We have developed this approach to smart cities based on the challenges that we have identified working with country offices and with cities and local national governments. So we have here 3 thematic areas that could be the challenges that the smart cities or governments face on a normal basis. So we have divided them in three main categories, which would be adaptable cities, which would be the needs to adapt to climate change, to become more resilient, to promote cleaner and healthier environments for the citizens. Inclusive cities, which is everything about making services more accessible, more inclusive, improving transparency of governments, safety in the cities, providing economic opportunities, etc. And then sustainable cities, which would be everything more related to precisely circular economy, so how we use resources in a more efficient way, water, energy, waste, food, etc. So all the resources that are limited and we need to use better. And then smart city drivers are the foundations or the elements that you will probably come across when trying to solve this or tackle these thematic areas or these city challenges with digital technologies, or with innovative practices. So we have divided them in four. Digital infrastructure, which would be everything related to which kind of equipment to use, the connectivity between equipments, which sensors do I need to use, how do they communicate, etc. So all this kind of more equipment related stuff and infrastructure. Then data management and analysis, which is everything related to how do I get this data, how do I digitalize data, how do I store it and treat it and actually analyze this data to have actionable insights to make policy making. Smart city governance is everything related to regulations, ethical problems, privacy concerns, etc. So everything that helps that these new technologies or innovative ways of working are embedded and have the proper regulatory status. And finally, the financing. So how do we fund these initiatives? How do we approach the private sector? How can we generate new partnerships that help to finance that in a sustainable way, which is interesting for everyone? And then all of this is under the guiding principles of taking a systems approach, because it's never just about one specific challenge. We always find that these different thematic areas are really related to other aspects of the city. Also taking a practical and outcomes focused approach. So always having in mind which are the outcomes and the objectives of the projects, with an inclusive and sustainable approach too. So it is necessary that this is embedded in all the project. And also in our side, we work very closely with Singapore government, with which we have a long-term, long collaboration history. So how do we approach all these aspects when in the real life? We work in collaboration with our country offices in all the beneficiary countries, and we have several smart city alliance or different activities that we do with them. So from one side, just to highlight the most important, we have the smart city delivery, which is really working closely with the country offices and the national and local governments on the assessment or defining the strategy or implementing projects related to smart cities. We also have the community of practice, in which we try to put together different kinds of stakeholders involved in these challenges. So the cities or the public authorities, practitioners, academia, corporate, whoever is necessary to identify very specific challenges on one technology or one challenge, and then try to propose how to overcome these barriers or problems into using these new technologies or methods. A Smart City Insights platform and sharing knowledge is about generating knowledge and sharing knowledge that can be useful for all the community interested in these topics. And then building expertise with is providing this kind of webinars and capacity buildings internally and externally about the smart cities and digitalization. So we have been we are already working with several country offices and countries in this smart city delivery. With other ones, so in this map, some of them are active pilots, some others are collaborations that we are exploring with some country offices. So we are working with several of them already in circular economy. And what we have observed is that working on circular economy, the topic is a really complex topic that requires from the beginning an analysis of the current situation and taking a system approach perspective. And also that is very useful to disaggregate the different elements which are part of a circular economy in order to focus the intervention. The lack of data sometimes also can be a problem in order to focus the intervention and measure the results. So what we try to do is look for alternative sources of data, and also we rely a lot on the involvement of stakeholders in order to identify what are the most pressing needs of these different involved stakeholders, where are the bottlenecks, etc. So it really helps also when it's always useful, but also when there's lack of data, it's particularly powerful to use some design thinking methodologies to get this kind of information. Also talking about the stakeholders, even if we focus in just one area of circular economy, there are a wide diversity of stakeholders and a large number of them. So it's really important to invest some time into a proper stakeholder mapping, selecting which are the stakeholders that can provide us the most strategic information and with which is best option to to collaborate on their initiatives. And also, one of the things that we have observed too is that there's never an easy and fits-all response. So it's never just about finding the right technology for this. Normally, these topics are so complex that it's beyond this one single technology. So it involves talking about regulations, how to generate them or enforce them, or how to improve, promote behavioral change among the populations, etc. And finally, the monitoring and evaluation. Sometimes we do not have proper ways of monitoring our impact, or we do not measure all the elements of the circular economy in our project. So this is also a change of mindset that can be very interesting. So seeing all these challenges in the domain of circular economy, that's why we decided to make our first webinar about this topic. More webinars, open webinars will be upcoming in the following weeks. We will be trying to do several webinars every few weeks. So if you want to keep updated about them, just follow us on our social media, subscribe to our newsletter, and also after this event, we will be sending you a small survey asking you if you would like to have other topics in this kind of webinar. So please answer that and let us know your opinion. And I finish here, so I will leave the floor to Tamara to begin with her presentation.
Thank you, Elba. Let me just share my screen. Sorry. Okay, now we go to presentation mode. Thank you for the introduction. I'm very happy to be here virtually today. The circular city in practice, circular opportunities for cities. So let me just get 1 second part of this. Okay. So cities are the future. They're centers of creativity, the places where people interact, but also the place where the majority of the global population lives. And they're growing, as I'm sure everybody knows. But cities are also big impact points. So although they only cover 3% of the global land surface, they are responsible for consuming 75% of all global resources and produce about 60 to 80% of all greenhouse gases, making them big leverage points if you want to change something in the world, such as addressing climate change, of course. So these resources aren't always distributed equally, nor are environmental impacts, both within but also outside of cities. So what we're seeing is, of course, these cities are growing, and this growth is going to take place in the developing world. And what we will see is that there's most of the energy demand is going to take place, and also there's a lot of material demand, of course, with these cities that are so rapidly growing. So if you want to go and think about a circular economy, it's very important that we address how to go about that material use and energy demand in a circular way. So we are currently in this extractive economy where we take a lot of resources from the ground. We have these big monoculture farming practices to fulfill our needs as a society, but we also use a lot of land for that and take forests and biodiversity, like we exchange that basically. And then we produce these products that are sometimes very difficult to take apart, and we ship them all over the world, and then we waste them. So we call this a linear economy. So take, make, waste. And this is actually crossing our planetary boundaries. I'm sure you've seen this graph before, or maybe you haven't. This is from the Stockholm Resiliency Center, and it shows 9 planetary boundaries that we shouldn't cross if we want to maintain a livable planet for all human species. So what we see here is that there's actually two of these boundaries that we've already transgressed to a point that it's very hard to bring it back, a zone of uncertainty. So I don't know if I can you guys see my screen? Okay, Elba, could you tell me that? Because there's no...
We see your screen perfectly.
Okay, very good, because there's some things popping up with me. Okay, so place where we've transgressed in the biosphere integrity. We are losing a lot of species, but we're also losing a lot of very crucial building blocks for our food system, such as phosphorus and nitrogen. So we need to go towards a different system, because this is causing a lot of environmental impacts, both inside and outside of these cities, like I was saying. So toxic environments, but also lots of waste, but also extreme weather events such as flooding or air pollution. So how might these cities grow without crossing the planetary boundaries while dividing sufficient resources in a just and equitable way amongst all our inhabitants? So this is what we're working on with Metabolic. Our mission is to transition the global economy to a fundamentally sustainable state as soon as possible. And we're doing that not only by working with, from a consulting angle with governments, but also businesses and non-for-profits, but also with our think tank, where we really do applied research and in-depth research to come up with these new methodologies, and also with a ventures branch. So we also start new ventures, such as Spectral, which is really working towards the future of smart grids and energy. And we've grown quite a bit over the last year. So we're not only 40 people, we're closer to 50 now, and we're based in Amsterdam. So one way of going towards this fundamentally sustainable state is by going from a linear economy to a circular economy. And we can see the circular economy, and I think I've touched upon that before, is a means of staying within these planetary boundaries and not crossing the biosphere, while at the same time fulfilling in our needs in a just and equitable way. When we think about the circular economy, often we think about the first thing that pops up is recycling, right? Like doing something different with your waste and just throwing it away and disposing. But is that circular, right? So if you have an iPhone or a piece of electronics and we are recycling that, we often don't know where it goes. And what we have to think about is that we avoid burden shifting, because it could also have a negative impact on the community that technology ends up with, or the energy that it takes to dispose of that. So therefore we came up, so to kind of avoid this burden shifting, we came up with a model for circular and inclusive cities, the 7 pillars. So this makes sure that we really cover all these different aspects. So not only materials in the economy that are cycled on the continuous high value, also all energy is based on renewable sources. Water is extracted at a sustainable rate and resource recovery is maximized. Biodiversity is structurally supported, but also on the human side, like human health, let's think about that, human society and culture, and preserve it, and different types of value. So not only monetary, but also other things like education and time and maybe aesthetics. And we approach everything from a systems approach. So that's really about like understanding the complex dynamics of a system, and then also making sure that we address the root cause. And that really can help identify interventions that will actually address these root causes and leverage meaningful change. And it will also avoid the burden shifting. So this is the methodology we usually use, both with our work with industries, like the agri-food sector or chemicals or packaging, but also with cities and the built environment. So we start with the current state analysis. Where are we now? So really mapping what the system looks like. Then we set a goal or a vision. So where do we want to go? Where do we want to end up? And then we start backtracking. How do we get there? And finally, we find it very important that, of course, we all know strategies. I'm sure that many have seen big stacks of them, but it's very important to then also make that translation to actual implementation. So we always make a point of staying involved. And we work on different scales. I've now pulled in most of the city stuff because we're talking smart cities. So we work from the building level. What are smart or circular buildings? What does a sustainable building actually look like? But also then how does that building live in a neighborhood or a community? And how do these different buildings interact? And what is the role of that community within a bigger setting, a bigger city or a metropole? And then also regionally, thinking about peri-urban regions and how different material flows or food flows through these regions. Now, we've been at it for, I think, about 8 years. And what I thought we do today is just address a couple of insights we've picked up over these years in working with different cities. The first one being about bottom-up experimentation and incremental growth. So sometimes when you start with something that is a physical implementation, you can really take the knowledge you get there and build it out to bigger methodologies and impacts elsewhere. So that's also what we did. We started with the Keuvel, so that's about 7-8 years ago, which is our living lab in Amsterdam. So how that went is the municipality of Amsterdam had a piece of polluted land in the north, and they put out a tender, and they asked who wants to have this land for about 10 years, while also cleaning it up. So what we did is we wanted to make, or this was the founder of Metabolic with a lot of partners, they wanted to make the most circular neighborhood working environment that exists. So this is 14 houseboats being pulled on the land, and they're connected by a boardwalk, and underneath there's a remediating park. So while there's like a lot of like social small enterprises there and a cafe, they're also at the same time cleaning the soil. And we're testing a lot of new technologies, both low tech and a bit more high tech. So these boats, you can see them here, they're all connected by smart grid, so they're exchanging energy. They also have their own currency. So if one has more energy and the other one uses more, they can exchange and then get some value back for it. We also have struvite reactors. So struvite is made out of urine. It is not connected to the sewer. So everybody has their own compost toilets. And there's an aquaponics farm that is connected to a restaurant. So we're actually in a greenhouse creating our own food there. And there's these remediating plants. And there's also a big community feeling. So all of these boats have small social enterprises in them. So starting with that project, we actually scaled up. So we scaled up to the neighborhood that is surrounding that living lab and really thought about like, what does a circular neighborhood look like? Again, with a lot of partners from the community. And then we brought these practices to a wider scale, the city scale. And we worked with Amsterdam on many different facets and are still working with Amsterdam, but also are now working globally. We worked first with Rotterdam and other cities in Europe, but are also now exploring work in Asia and also in the US. We're working a lot in Canada, like really on all scales, and also citywide strategies. So what did we learn there? Like having an actual living lab can really make a space to create a tangible narrative. So what is this circular economy and what does it look like? So since this place has a cafe, people can also come and then learn about like what happens. It also helps understanding rules and regulations, and also where sometimes they can be bent a little. So this is a site that is an experimentation. So the rules and regulations are a bit looser than in the rest of the city, which is very nice because it allows you to actually test things. And then, you know, sometimes when it is implemented, it sticks around. And then also it can be a catalyst for surrounding neighborhoods. So, you know, we saw here, like we had the Keuvel and then also for Buiksloterham, the surrounding neighborhood, that really became a beacon of transition. So it actually helps influencing other neighborhoods in a very positive way. And then experimentation doesn't have to be high tech, or technologies doesn't have to be that high tech. There's many different things that we're trying out. And for example, compost toilets, of course, have been around for a very long time, but it's still working very well at that place. Okay, point 2, start with understanding where you are now. I already touched upon the methodology a little bit and said like, hey, we really start with bringing these systems, mapping systems, and really seeing what, you know, like how sustainable is a place now. And that is not only about the different stakeholders or the material flows. We do a lot of data analysis, but it's also really about understanding existing initiatives. And I really like this map of the African Circular Economy network, because what it does is it shows what kind of initiatives are already happening, because the circular economy and the practices related to them aren't new, of course. Like what we see here is there's a lot of permaculture farms or composting places, but also new ways of upcycling. So I think this is a very nice way of framing the circular economy by showing what is already there and what is already happening. So seeing what kind of initiatives are out there and where are we now, right? But also what stakeholders are related to that. So this is, these are 2 maps that we took of a project with the city of Charlotte in the United States, and I will get more in depth on that project later on. But I just wanted to show that it's also important to see what kind of stakeholders you're dealing with, right? So if you are gathering data, for example, it's very important that we know and build a relationship with a driving group, but also know who has which data and how, and you know, that can help getting a more holistic picture. And also tying it to a spatial location. So this was a map of where all the waste infrastructure is happening. And what we saw is that, you know, and this is sometimes, or this is something that often happens in cities from an environmental justice perspective, that most of the waste infrastructure was based in the neighborhoods where also the lowest social mobility was found. Then we also often do a material flow analysis, and I'm not sure if many of you are familiar with those. So what I would like to do is just like briefly walk through it. So what you see here is a material flow analysis for the city of Rotterdam, and the way that you read it is from the left side. There's resources going into the city, and on the right side there's resources flowing out of the city. So we can see that as waste. So what we do is we use these big diagrams to identify the biggest leverage points for change. So if we look at and I'll go more into that later on as well, but if we look at the right side, you'll see that there's a lot of waste being incinerated right now in Rotterdam, whereas there could also be something else done with these materials on higher value. But we'll dive into this one a bit later. And maybe good to add that also for the city of Rotterdam, we looked at some different economic sectors, right? We looked at the agri-food sector, we looked at you know, the construction sector and the built environment, but also we looked at hospitals and mapped consumer goods and the embedded impacts that these have. So this is, so the last was a material flow analysis that was of course two-dimensional. We can also make that spatial. This is a project we did together with the AMS Institute and TU Delft for the European Union. And what we see here is the same thing. So this is mapping food flows and food waste in a region. And then the reason for doing this spatially is to, when you know what, where, and who produces different flows of food or, you know, waste flows, you can also link these easier to new initiatives or link them together. You know, like maybe there's a bakery that can make bread with the waste from another company. So that's really the thinking behind this. And this is leading to an open source tool that then can be used by different small businesses, but also governments. All right, so understanding where you are now. So some of the takeaways that we found is that, you know, like cities are at different points of readiness, but also have different data available. So it is not always easy to acquire. So what I was saying earlier, it's important to have a driving group of stakeholders so that you can get data from different places. But also sometimes it requires a lot of research and then taking national averages, for example, and downscaling them, or taking smaller sample sizes and upscaling them. So we really try to be as accurate as possible, but sometimes we have to revert to research or some of these standard numbers to create our models. So as I was saying, include stakeholders from the beginning to form a driving group. This is also really nice when you come to strategy and interventions and a vision, because it can be broadly carried. When we really think about implementation, it's important that interventions are selected that are not only very impactful, but also have a high feasibility, right? So there's momentum for that, and there's actual business case, and there's stakeholders that want to take that further. So it's very important to include these from the beginning. And then as to the point of the Circular Network, Circular Africa Network, is build on local initiatives, but also on policy agendas. So see where everybody's at and what is out there already, and really build on that. Okay, from strategy to implementation. So first going back to Rotterdam. So as I was saying before, like oftentimes, you know, the end product of a study is a strategy, but we really want to make sure that we get to implementation, and implementation isn't always fast. So zooming in on one of the sectors of Rotterdam, so current state analysis, again, what we see here is the construction sector. So we see construction, renovation, but also demolition. And then I would like you to kind of focus on the right side, the waste side, where we see that a lot of construction materials are actually downcycled. This means that they're not used to their full value or to their highest value. And there's also a lot of them wasted. So We can then think about a couple, like many different interventions, right, that we could use to address that. So you could reduce the amount of building materials from the beginning. So really thinking about, maybe we can implement a building hub so that there's not as much wasted. A lot of waste is happening in the construction sector because also of time management. But there's also ways of synergizing, right? Like mapping, where's demolition happening, but also where is construction happening, and can we tie these to each other so that when materials are demolished at one site, maybe there can be a new material for another project. And then of course there's production and purchasing. Like if we can't do it with secondary materials for construction, maybe there's guidelines for what are the best materials and the most circular materials to purchase. And then finally, there's management. So it's important that in the construction sector, we take the entire life cycle into account. So can we implement material passports when we are building, right? So then we can know exactly what kind of materials are in the built environment, but also if we demolish again, we know what we can use for what purpose. So the way that we weigh these interventions is, like I was getting to a bit earlier, is like the impact versus the feasibility. So what we try to do is we try to map what the impact is of these certain interventions towards achieving where we want to go, towards achieving our vision. And then also addressing, of course, the points of most impact. And then we also look at the feasibility. So that's really related to the readiness of an organization to implement, or a municipality to implement something like this. Also, of course, technological readiness. Is it financially viable, or can we come up with a business case that everybody is behind? And of course, policy, is it allowed, rules and regulations. So that's really what we think about when we think about feasibility. And then we often start with a very long list, and then we go towards a short list based on kind of doing the mapping of these interventions and calculating their impact. So in Rotterdam, it's been really nice. Like, we've been involved for a couple of years now. So we have made that strategy and calculated all the impacts, came up with a long list, and now we're really in the intervention or the implementation phase together with Blue City, a local partner there in the municipal government. We are building one of a building hub. So what we did is we really mapped where should this building hub be, and then also what projects are going to be demolished and which ones are going to be constructed within the next couple of years, and can we tie these together? And what has been really nice is then you also revisit your strategy, because you get a much clearer idea of how these sectors actually work, right? Because if you are going to implement a building hub, construction hub for construction materials, who should own it? Which actors are involved? How can we organize that? So it really also ties back to really having these stakeholders involved and having a good overview of how the system works. A second case study, going to Charlotte in North Carolina. This is a project that we worked on 2 years ago together with a partner in Vision Charlotte, local partner in the municipality. So here as well, we went from strategy to implementation, starting with a current state analysis and a visioning, of course. So Charlotte is the first city in the US to make a public commitment on adopting the circular economy. And they wanted to address multiple things. So on one side, they had a low social mobility, so it was very hard to get out of poverty in that city. But on the other side, they also had an issue with an outdated waste infrastructure, and they wanted to address that. And there was very low participation, for example, in programs that were there, such as recycling programs. So they wanted to address multiple issues, and that's something that the circular economy is very applicable or very useful for, or the principles. So what we did there is, again, a current state analysis. This is only looking at the waste sector. So we looked at households, commercial entities, but also the construction sector and the public sector. And here again, we see all the materials flowing towards where they are then treated. So we see differences between plastics, textiles, metals, glass, etc. But also landfill, incineration, and then also some recycling. And here, and you see these little triangles where we identified leverage points, or leverage points for impact. We see that a lot of waste is going to landfill. Actually, the bulk of all of Charlotte's waste is going to landfill, and there's a lot of value in that. So what we then did for each of these impact points, we tried to calculate how much value is in it. So can we, like here we talked about plastics and how much is landfilled. You could really spare a lot of, or save a lot of barrels of oil. Also, there's lots of revenue in that. And then we related it to jobs. How many jobs can we create if there's different collection systems, for example, or different recycling systems for plastics? And then, like I was saying, like it's important to give to make something very tangible when we talk about strategy. So for 5 of these interventions, so for example, a circular concrete chain, but also a different collection system, and the black soldier flies, which actually are very good for composting and kind of dealing with compost. We really calculated how many jobs could be created, but also the carbon emissions. And we talked to stakeholders on how these business cases could be formalized. And then we saw that with these 5 business cases, there could be a total of 100,000 tons of waste to landfill prevented. And, you know, like almost up to 500 jobs being created. The carbon emissions could be reduced, and also each business case improves a lot of the key performance indicators, because that's something that, of course, and I didn't put that slide in here, but between thinking about these business cases and a current state analysis, of course, we set a vision, and we also link these to key performance indicators to make sure that the strategy that we set is actually achieving our goals. So it's about checking in and really monitoring. Yeah, so what's next? So also with Charlotte, like in Rotterdam and in Amsterdam, we're still very much involved. So we're actually helping the city, or one of my colleagues actually, she's helping the city apply for funding for the implementation of some of these interventions. Also, like we had a living lab, the Keuvel, in Amsterdam, we're also working towards implementing a living lab there in Charlotte that could also serve like as like a showcase of what circular technologies are, but also as an incubator for small businesses. And then we're also working on implementing solutions around concrete recycling. So what do you learn, or what did we learn when we think about strategy to implementation? So one of the points is like it really takes time. So, you know, like this is not something that we can do in a month. So it's important to stay involved long term. So we start with solutions that have a high impact, but are also feasible. So when we map these strategies in time, we start, you know, like we really think about like what can we do first and what can also have a high impact. And then also, of course, what can have a high impact, but is a bit trickier. We put a bit further down the line. And then it's important to collaboratively, and I think I touched upon this point a couple of times already, but it's important to collaboratively develop these strategies. So not only with a municipal government, but also with stakeholders, community organizations, private companies, community organizations, and educational facilities. So really involving, in Amsterdam, they have a fancy word for this, and they call it the quadruple helix, but really involving these different stakeholders. Now, finally, scaling up to new geographies. As I mentioned, we really derive a lot from understanding the system. It's so important to get a good image of where you are now and who's involved and what material flows we are dealing with. And it takes a while to understand that. So as we have been scaling up as a company, going from the Keuvel, the Living Lab, to a neighborhood, to Amsterdam, to other cities, we see that you know, that takes time. So how do you go about that? So one thing that we are building right now is an international knowledge network. So we are really trying to have cities collaborate and then you know, stimulate them in sharing results, but also evidence-based impact, right? Like what technology, best practices, what technologies work or what interventions work, and how can you implement them best? So one of our projects right now is the Circular Cities program in Poland, where we are working together with 4 cities, Warsaw, Lublin, Kraków, and Gdańsk, to come up with it's a 1-year program to co-create these strategies. It's basically the similar approach to Charlotte. And what we do during that time is also link them to each other to exchange knowledge and results. And then we also think that taking in a city approach can really have a good impact for the national government as well into achieving their goals. So what we do there is, again, we start with zero waste. We start with waste, but then you'll often see, because of these 7 pillars, right? Waste is related to energy. It's also related to water, but also to human health, of course, and value. There's value in waste, as well as biodiversity. Yeah, and that's also like thinking about that systems approach. So this is about going and linking cities together as a way of going into new geographies. But there's, of course, also cities that we're not working with right now. So we're really trying to see what is the best way of building capacity or building the tools to, the tools to help scale the circular economy and its implementation up. So one of those are actually sharing methodologies. So this is a roadmap for circular land tendering for Amsterdam that we've translated to English, and we really want to have out there, because what it can help with is that if a government has a piece of land and somebody wants to buy it, there's certain principles, sustainable principles or principles for inclusivity that the bidder has to comply with in order to be eligible to get that piece of land. Another one, and this is again that image from Charlotte, is really having a database of evidence-based interventions and their impact. So showing what works and what not, and sharing that broadly. And then tools, and this is something that we've really have been exploring together with some other partners, is can we build tools so that other organizations in other cities and countries can do these analyses themselves as a basis for creating strategies. So that's where we are right now. And then what we've learned from that process is that the context is really key, right? Like, so you can't have a similar approach in every city. It's just different. So therefore, it's very important to have a local partner. This is also in our work in Poland. We work together with Innovo, which is a great organization that has a very big network, but also understands how the Polish governments work. And what also helps is that they speak very good Polish, which I don't. And then data is always a bottleneck, right? Because it's hard to get, like it's often behind closed doors. What would really help is that everybody that does a project about creating more sustainable environments, that there would be a big database where everything would be stored so that we can all access it afterwards. This is a bit of a pipe dream that maybe, let's hope we get to that. And then finally, like sharing methodologies and tools, like there's a lot of that out there, but then I think it also is important to then build the capacity or work with organizations to, on how to use these best. I think I wanted to stop here, and I'm very much open to questions, but I also wanted to pass it on to Geoffrey to tell us more about what is going on in Kenya. So I'll stop sharing my screen.
Okay. So Tamara, one of the last questions that were posted, that I think is quite interesting, is by Max. And he asks, like, first, what are the current most circular cities that you would identify? Which cities are transitioning most quickly towards a circular state of affairs? And how do you view the role of satellites in the process of creating smart cities and regions?
All right, so 3 questions. So what are the most circular cities? So first of all, I think it's important, like for me, like what I see is like, I see circular principles or circular economy as a means of achieving long-term like sustainability and inclusivity in cities. What are the most circular cities? I think is a very difficult question, because it depends on like if you want to compare all of them together. And I think what we've also talked about is that how cities are very different. So I think you could say that a city that isn't using as much energy as another city is more circular than the other, right? So what we see is that, for example, whereas we might assume that a city like New York has their things together very well, they're using a lot of more resources than a city like Lagos is. So who is more circular? What we also see is that there's, like what I mentioned before, is that these cities are different readiness levels, but also have created different visions. So if you want to compare a city based on what they set for their own goals, and they're achieving that can be very, very circular. But then again, like comparing it to the other one might not say as much. I think, of course, our hometown Amsterdam is like where we are based, is doing a lot of very innovative things. What I think there is working very well is that that they're providing a lot of space for experimentation, and they're really driving implementation right now. and I think if you ask, like, according to which KPIs, I think these KPIs are a very important aspect, right? So if we are going to set a vision, we also need to be able to measure where we are. Now, these KPIs can vary very broadly, right? For Charlotte, we've set KPIs very much related to waste. So the percentage of waste going to landfill, and if they're making progress on these. But you can also take that further. You can talk about energy that is created from renewable resources, the percentage of building materials and new construction projects that are from secondary sources. So there's, you know, like, depending on what the vision you set and the ambitions you have as a city, where you really want to focus, these KPIs are related to that. Which cities are transitioning most quickly? Yeah, so I think, like, as an example, I used Amsterdam. I think they're really making progress. It's cities that want to move to implementation fast, and are, I think it's very important to work collaboratively in that, but also don't, like, that sometimes can also paralyze, right? And in the Netherlands, we do a lot of poldering because we're used to battling all the water, and I think sometimes it can also have the wrong effect of staying in the conversation too long instead of going forward, because we want to be mindful of every one. So I think there's, like, a sweet spot between that. And then the role of satellites in the process of creating smart cities and regions. Yeah, satellites, of course, have the very nice ability to give a good overview. I think one of our biggest challenges over the next, like, at least, like, in European cities, and North American cities, I think, is, like, integrating nature into cities, like creating biodiverse habitats that are not only for humans but also for other species. And I think satellites can play a very big role in assessing globally also the state of our nature, our natural systems and our ecosystems, and kind of assessing where we are. And I think also for cities, that's a good part of a current state analysis, seeing what the quality of these natural patches are.
Thank you, Tamara. I think that you covered very well the three questions. Another one, more technical, is from Siddharth Panfani. Asks, how do you carry out the current state analysis? What are the obstacles that you think are faced when implementing real-time and current state analysis instead of using other approximation methodologies?
Yeah, so of course, one of the things that would be really, really amazing is if we would have a real-time dashboards that shows at all times how many resources we are using and how the things are flowing. But of course, there's a lot of challenges there with collecting data and having access to that, but also like monitoring, right? So usually how we start with a material flow analysis is we first map what we, like we do an economic analysis and a social analysis, and kind of determine what sectors we want to include in that. Then we start collecting data, and that's, like we start, for example, with the municipal government, seeing what is out there. We also approach different stakeholders to collect data. So really, and then if I say data, I'm talking about the amount of waste that is produced by a city. It is very important to, first of all, determine, like, what is your system, right? Are you going to use the boundaries of the city, or are you going to take a regional approach? And then also thinking which actors might have data. So what we saw in Charlotte is that there's a lot of data with the city, but there's also much data with the county. And then, like the different waste management practices are also governed by these different entities. So we start with the government collecting, then also approaching stakeholders. Sometimes, like I was saying, finding averages, like doing a lot of research, finding, for example, what is the diet of an average Dutch person in the north of Holland, and then using that data to collect, to kind of make an estimation of how much food is consumed, right? So that's an approach that we try to fill gaps like that. So it's really about kind of trying the best you can to get the most accurate data out there and to get the most recent data, and then trying to fill the gaps with these, like researches. And then one thing that is also important to note is that what we showed with that 2D, right, like the current state analysis, the material flow analysis of Charlotte and Rotterdam, these are images over a year, right? When we talk about repair, like the more geospatial dashboard we took, you could also select, I want to see what happens in a day. And you know, like what we want to move towards is like really having this real-time dashboard, but of course that's that requires a lot of data and a lot of monitoring.
Mm-hmm.
That answers the question.
Yes, I saw another one which is quite technical about what you mentioned about the construction sector. So related to demolishing, how do we transition to disassembly to better utilize materials in a building? So how do you do this kind of link between the two?
Yeah, so how do you create, because now if we demolish buildings, like often things are glued together and it's very hard to take them apart, right? So then you lose a lot of materials because you have to break them. So one of the things that I mentioned was that material passport, right? We can map what kind of materials are in a building, but then it also talks to how to assemble buildings, right? Like how can we construct? So we have to construct in a circular way where we might use smart technologies or smart systems to put things together instead of gluing them. And then there's also circular demolishing practices where you really take buildings apart in a different way. And then of course we also talk about renovation, right? So what we see is that there's a big, for example, Amsterdam has a big monumental city center. How do you renovate there? Can we think about different materials that we can use for isolation, for example, instead of you know, like limiting the energy use, and then thinking about the least impactful materials and the most environmentally sound. Does that answer a bit the question?
I think so. I think so. Phil just told me that Geoffrey is ready.
Great.
Now, so Geoffrey, up to you.
Yeah.
Floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I hope that's a bit clearer now. Nifal, you can put up the presentation so we can be able to take in some of the lessons we are seeing and emerging on the circular economy conversation from Kenya's perspective. I was just saying that one of the great opportunity we have here is to link the waste conversation to the nationally determined contributions, NDCs. So these are new opportunities for countries and including Kenya to see how we can be able to enhance the emission reduction potential, but also the adaptation potentials. So if you could go to the next slide, please. So the beginning point was we really wanted to come up with a proposal that can be able to see how we utilize the huge amount of waste that was coming out of Kenya's urban areas, and especially Nairobi. And this was linking a lot to what Kenya is planning to do in terms of the NDC and looking at where there is a high opportunity for emission abatement. Obviously, the country is focusing a lot on forestry to reduce the emissions, but all the other sectors as well, electricity, transportation, energy demand, agriculture, industrial processes are also in the play in terms of trying to make Kenya a more cleaner and a more greener country utilizing the nationally determined contributions. So you notice that waste sector is one of the sectors that is within the NDC plans and therefore giving us an opportunity to prepare that proposal on circular economy using the waste process as well, to see how we can be able to leverage private sector engagement in this work, and how we can also attract a bit of innovative finance that will be able to help Kenya utilize this waste in the circular economy approaches that Tamara has mentioned previously. Next slide, please. Yes. So how did we structure the proposal on circular economy in Nairobi? First of all, the long-term strategy that we had was we were hoping to process around 600 tons of waste for recycling and also for utilizing within the circular economy approaches daily. And this is only 25% of the total waste that comes from Nairobi. Our estimation was we would manage to realize 800,000 tons in CO2 emission reductions within the 15-year of the project. And we would increase the number of jobs available close to 1,600 jobs to the economy. In terms of the opportunities, one of the critical areas that we saw within this project is waste to energy, how we can be able to leverage on this waste to include a bit more energy opportunities within Kenya's energy mix, but maybe to also inform the people following that Kenya is one of the countries that has one of the highest renewable energy contribution to our electricity grid at a high of 86% of our entire electricity derives from renewable sources, 30% from hydro, 24% from geothermal, 12% from wind. We only have around 29% that's coming from thermal diesel generated generators. But these are mostly utilized to manage the load so that when we have a high peak demand for energy, then the thermal generators kick in. But the government is trying to work to reduce, to ensure that 100% of our electricity will be derived fully from renewable sources. And this is where an opportunity also for the waste comes in, because there's a lot of opportunity to derive some bit of energy from here. So we structured the project in 2 phases. The first phase will be on the infrastructure. You require a lot of infrastructure in place to collect the waste, to sort the waste, to ensure that the processing starts, and then hopefully we were hoping to be doing 200 tons of waste per day, but that was to grow to around 600 tons of waste recycled within the 15-year period. And therefore we'll realize a bit of circular economy approaches within the country. But the important point to add here is that although the public sector is important in regulating this, the private sector has a very important role to play here, because there's a business aspect to this that only the private sector can be able to effectively realize. So if you could move to the next slide, please. So, but what are the basics, and how has Kenya prepared itself to be able to pitch into a circular economy model, and what are some of the infrastructure that we have been able to lay so far with UNDP support and other partner support? Number one, the important point, and I think Tamara mentioned it, is the issue of planning. It's important to have the visioning right, and that the national visions should effectively articulate circular economy and identify opportunities of embedding it in their 5-year or 10-year or blueprints. And this has happened in Kenya's case. Most of the plans are trying to be very futuristic in trying to see how we can be able to achieve a low economy pathway utilizing the circular economy. The second one, also you've mentioned it, the issue of urban plans. They come in very, very importantly, because if you're looking at waste, then you realize that most of the waste will be coming out from these urban areas. And so the utilization of GIS is important. So in Kenya, we are working to have the county spatial plans in place that are GIS based, that will be able to identify all the areas where the waste is coming from, and where it's being stored, where it's being collected, and where it can be able to be, if private sector want to go in, then they can be able to effectively have this data at the palm of their hand. So this is some of the elements that we are working on currently to strengthen in Kenya. Then within the planning conversation, there's a whole question of financing. How would you finance some of these plans that you're putting up that are looking at how to embed a circular economy into your work? So in Kenya, we have undertaken our first climate public budget expenditure review, and working currently to embed the budget coding within the National Treasury to also encourage domestic budgetary allocations to some of these plans, and also strengthening the climate finance conversation in Kenya that will be able to attract a bit more international finance and also bring in private sector to effectively benefit from it. But also, we have also worked on an integrated measurement, reporting, and verification system currently, so we can effectively also get the data that's coming out of the work we are doing, and then be able to report on it when it comes to the greenhouse gas emission potential that we've been able to realize. But I'll speak a lot on the MRV system in my next slide. On the right, you find the importance of a sound regulatory and a policy framework. So we have a very progressive constitution in Kenya that has sustainable development as a principle of governance, but there's a lot of work that's required to realize that a broad statement of intent into practical, tangible solutions. We have a robust regulatory framework with a lot of legislations, a Climate Change Act, an action plan for climate change issues, the national determined contributions, and also an emerging waste management policy and regulatory frameworks to really look at how we can attract this waste and turn it into valuable wealth. And that's a critical area that we have also been working in as UNDP. And then also, how do we enforce this? Because enforcing it is also quite critical. Once you have all these plans and all these regulations, then enforcement capacity is important, and that's some of the work we're doing it. So you realize that the private sector will benefit from these plans and the sound regulatory framework, but the policies should be able to enhance the ease of doing business. We should look at how to de-risk some of the investments the private sector will be making in this area. And a lot of practical solutions exist out there in terms of how to de-risk some of these measures to make it attractive for the private sector to come in. What are some of the investment frameworks that exist within the country that can be able to enable private sector to be able to come into this area and make value out of it? Also, what are the technical innovations that are available globally, and how can we leverage on them to bring them down to the ground and see how can we be able to apply them? So the private sector will be driving a lot of this thinking, but they require good plans and a sound regulatory and policy framework. Next slide, please. Yes, so I spoke about an integrated monitoring, measurement, reporting, and verification system. If you were to benefit from some of the ambition that you're trying to achieve as a country or as a city in terms of reducing emissions and utilizing waste to enhance your NDC, then you will realize that you need to have a very strong system for tracking and reporting, and that's what we've been able to work on here in Kenya, that looks at all the reporting requirements, that looks at the national greenhouse gas inventory to be able to effectively estimate the emission reductions that you are likely to realize from applying such a circular economy approach, and you'll be able to have a clear modality of reporting on all this. So we have worked on an integrated system that is online, cloud-based, that we are going to be deploying with government entities, and we'll focus a lot on training to be able to get the right data to put into this. And then we can be able to effectively estimate what you can be able to achieve if you deploy a circular economy approach to the waste management area. So this is just a slide to emphasize the importance of measurement, reporting, and verification, and also tracking some of the finance that's coming into this area, and including private sector finance and international finance, as well as the government finance, and linking it also to the SDGs tracking. If you can go to the next slide now. Yes, so these are just some of the broad aspects we are seeing. We have a lot of waste that comes out of Nairobi. On the right, you can see the Dandora dump site, which has a lot of waste, and it's one of the major challenge that has its own political economy dimensions. But we also have some successful business solutions that have emerged that are applying a circular economy approach. I've highlighted their Taka solutions. I think you can, once we share this presentation, you can be able to look at how they are managing to make a sustainable business model around it. They are recycling some of the waste, they are repackaging some of them, and they are being able to derive some positive returns here. It implies that there's an opportunity for private sector to make value out of applying a circular economy approach, and that it's possible if all the regulations are in place. If the private sector has been incentivized, then you can be able to effectively have a smart city that runs on a circular waste economy utilizing the waste approach. So that's just an example. You can be able to go in later on to get a bit more insights. Now, let me finalize now on the last slide and share some of the key lessons that I've been able to share to find in this presentation. The first one, that it's important to link the circular economy conversation to the climate change nationally determined contributions area, because it can be able to avail new opportunities for enhancing ambition, mobilizing more stakeholders around this area and accelerating climate action, in addition to reducing a lot of the pollution that waste has always been seen to provide. The second one, that in all this, the key lesson here is that visioning is critical, and the role of government in providing the broad policy regulatory frameworks that can be able to realize this is quite essential. So working with the national governments to enhance this is quite important. And then a very clear monitoring, measurement and reporting system is useful, because then it helps you effectively track what you are doing and whether you're actually realizing the returns that you wanted. And you can be able to unlock a bit more finance from the private sector or from the government or also from the international sources to realize this, to also avail some incentives for private sectors to effectively work in this area. But some of the incentives also may be policy de-risking, looking at the policies that will be able to make this sustainable to your private sector. Thank you so much. I think I've tried to do this within maybe 10 or 12 minutes. Over to you now, Elba and Tamara.
Thank you, Geoffrey. Super interesting to know more about your expertise in Kenya. I think that now our colleagues, the Paxi and Phil, have been selecting some questions and answers. So I think that they will be sharing them with us shortly.
Thanks, Elba. So we have a lot of questions from that amazing presentation, Geoffrey. So first, one of our participants have asked, could you share how long does each stage of the project typically last, and what kind of financial costs are involved?
Geoffrey?
Yes, thank you. This is a long-term process, because you can already see getting the policy and regulatory frameworks takes a bit of time. And even currently, we are still yet to get some of the policies that would enhance private sector buy-in in the area fully engaged. We are still working now under a new project on the NDC implementation acceleration to bring in all the ingredients that will be able to make this area attractive for private sector to come in. And so we had estimated that within 1 to 5 years, we will set in place the infrastructure. And then within the next 6 to 15 years, we'll be able to have some sustainable businesses running on this and applying this. The cost element is quite huge if you're looking at the private sector investments, but also the requirements for financing from the public sector to ensure that the system works. So I do not have yet a clear estimate of the same, but we can be able to share that, or you can be able to find it in the main document later on. Next.
I don't know if Tamara also might have some approximate on that. On our case, and when working with other country offices, what we have seen, if you are not working on like national plans, but maybe some more focused interventions, it really depends on the wide, the scope that you want to do in this intervention. So you can do like very targeted little interventions to begin to promote this change, and then it can be like you can be doing like some research in the first one month and a half, and then like doing some stakeholder engagement and have something to propose in some months. So it really depends on the scope of the intervention if it's not a national planning.
Yeah, I think that's a really good good answer to that. I think we're experiencing the same. It really depends on who we're working with. Is it a municipal government and we're trying to implement something citywide that might be more policy related, for example, then it might take a bit longer. But if it's like, for example, we're also working with a lot of developers, and sometimes they can implement something in a new project that is planned very soon. So it really depends. And then again, as I was saying, like experimentation is a really nice way of implementing. Because sometimes if you say like, we're only going to do this for the next 3 months, then maybe you're going to actually do it forever. So I think that's a nice way of like accelerating that implementation. Yeah.
Thank you, Tamara. So we also have another question for you. And the question is, in your assessment, have you also evaluated how to implement the circular economy in underdeveloped countries, like Afghanistan, for instance? Where can they start? Or do you perhaps have a small scale proposal for countries like that?
Is that for me? So yeah, so this is something that we're really trying to work towards, right? Like, so I think all suggestions are very welcome. Like I was saying, like, I think one of the most important approaches is to work with local partners and local organizations who actually understand the way the context works. And what we're really trying to do, like that systems approach, like starting with where you are now, of course, that's applicable to all contexts. Then when you get to forming strategies, and you know, like also the data gathering that is needed for getting that current state analysis, of course, it's very important to then adjust it to these type of like you're saying, under developing countries. But it's definitely something that we're still trying to really work out. Yeah.
Thank you. And this question, I think, will apply both to Tamara and Geoffrey. Is the circular economy only concerned about the production system and waste generation, or does it also look into the fiscal and financial policies and measures through taxes or green bonds, for example? So Tamara, maybe you go first.
Yeah, sure. I think these systems are crucial for anything that you might want to implement, right? I think financing mechanisms are key. Like if you think about cities and for example, green spaces traditionally don't give a lot of, like we see this a lot in area development, right? Like there's things that will generate value for investors, cost benefit. But then sometimes you have points where you have to invest, such as green space, but then the benefits stay with the community that is actually living there. And also, of course, like globally, since we have more nature and biodiversity, but then it's very difficult to make that like an attractive investment. So then green bonds and new impact financing systems are really important to get that done. Also, in terms of like rules and regulations coming from governments saying that these things are not allowed anymore, don't use these primary resources, I think are all crucial. So that's also very interrelated. But I'd also like to hear what Geoffrey.
Yeah, I agree. I think this is an area where you can't achieve a lot without a public and a private sector sitting on the same table. Some of these facilities or the broad infrastructure will obviously require a government investment in. And so government has to also deliberately set aside some budgets for the broad elements of it and the planning and all this visioning. But the private sector then will also have to come in and provide some bit of their own capital investment, because they do it with an interest to make profit. So once they see that it's a feasible idea, then that's clearly an area they would like to invest in. But broadly also, if you can bring in the public and make them realize that the waste that is out there is actually valuable, is wealth for them, they can also join in and provide some innovative financing solutions, crowdfunding, and also on the taxation regime, some bit of incentives here within governments to ensure that everybody can be able to allocate a bit of resources for managing their waste. So, but financing is a critical conversation that must be at the very center of this conversation. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. So maybe just to add one thing to what Geoffrey is saying is that I think adding to your analysis, like what benefits something like a new system could derive, like these business cases show, for example, I think is also a very nice way of showing that investments are attractive on the long term, right?
Thanks, Geoffrey and Tamara. I have some questions here specifically on Geoffrey's presentation. So the question is, certain big cities in developing countries have substantive circular economies already, but very slow smart city transition. What policy actions would you suggest to strengthen this linkage? Geoffrey?
Yeah, that's a good question. Most of the times we realize the regulations always follow the innovations, and that's a practical issue that is seen all over. The private sector will always be trying to push the boundaries of the regulators. The regulators take a bit of time to come into the area. So what would happen is a lot of these small-scale interventions need to be articulated to inform and influence the policy. And then once they become policy and you develop the standards, you develop the guidelines at the national level and you launch them, then they can be able to be adopted on a large scale. And that when we can be able to get a lot of the value out of it. So if you are a practitioner in the development terrain, a lot of studies, assessments, tracing the money, the economic impact of it can be useful to really proactively advocate for this to lead to a higher uptake and ensure that the whole city or the whole country is looking at it from that perspective. I think if you can be able to trace the money and follow the money, and there's a huge financial potential within a well-managed waste system in your region, you can be able to influence policymakers and hopefully push everybody to upscale some of these innovations. I've seen another question from Max and it links very much to this on what are some of the business opportunities that Kenyan business people are getting out of it. When we share the presentation, you can be able to go and look at how Takataka Solutions has managed from 2011 to build a sustainable business model around this waste. So they have a very clear system where they collect the waste from the households. So they also are paid for collecting the waste. So they make a bit of money from collecting the waste. But they also go and do the sorting, they analyze, then they get some very good products out of this waste. And also can be able to sustain that business model. If this is happening at a small scale company like that, you can imagine if we open this to large international companies to come in and really reanalyze all this, we will realize the value that this can be able to realize. Thank you.
Geoffrey, and just an add-on to this question you just answered. The Takataka solution in particular, how integrated has the solution been in the framework of planning and private sector and legal, and what can we learn from that?
Yes, thank you very much. In the Takataka solution has penetrated a lot of the urban areas in Nairobi, and they have been able to be approved by the local authorities to collect this waste. They have been authorized to set up the waste centers, waste processing centers. So they have the requisite standards and approvals required to be able to operate. And so that's one element of the interface between what a private sector is doing and what the local authorities need to do to allow them to operate. But there are not so much incentives that have been given to them from our analysis. They are just trying to make do with what they can manage out of it. So there's an opportunity to really incentivize them and see how they can be able to leapfrog some of the gains they are making, because they are providing a very important public good and service to the people, but also they are deriving economic livelihoods and also bringing out new innovations that are making our waste sustainable. But to be honest, we are yet to resolve the waste challenge in Kenya fully. We still have one of the largest dump sites in Africa. That's right in the center of the city, and there's a lot of work currently and analysis to see how all that can be put into the waste economy discussion. And maybe that's when we will be able to fully unlock the potentials within this industry. Thank you.
Thank you, Geoffrey. And I think we should just wrap up soon because we've run out of time. Maybe just one last question. All the other questions will be sent to Tamara and Geoffrey, and they will be able to choose a few to answer. But for now, since we have come to the end of the webinar, I'm just going to wrap up with one final question for Tamara and Geoffrey. If you could share, maybe describe your vision for a circular economy of the future in the countries that you're working in, what would that look like? Perhaps we start with Tamara and then Geoffrey.
That's I like that question. That's a big question. So if I think about the city scale, like I work a lot with cities, right? So if I think about the city scale, what I would like to see is that cities and natural areas are much more integrated, so that we don't use so much land for producing resources. There's a lot of biodiverse ecosystems outside of cities, but also they're integrated in cities. So there's a lot of green space. So, you know, like what also is good for climate adaptation, but also good for people to live in and for other species. So that cities also structurally support biodiversity. That's one point. The other one is that I would like cities or places where, you know, where there's serendipity, where there's new creative ideas, but there's also space to implement them, and people run into each other, and not everything is organized very smartly with, you know, there's a bit of space for experimentation. And I think generally the most important part is that we stop consuming more than we need. So I think also, and I think that's something that we're all living right now, right, in the COVID crisis. I think this is really a time to you know, like balance things out. What are the resources that we need? You know, what are we consuming? But also, can we do that in a different way? Can we do that so that we don't take in more space than we need? And also, can we make space for doing, you know, like low carbon activities such as gardening or composting or yeah. So I think my vision is for a place where we, like I was saying, like where we don't cross all these planetary boundaries and create toxic environments and promote climate change, but a place where we live within the means of our planet, also with other species, while, you know, creating a just and equitable environment for all inhabitants. Yeah.
Sounds like a nice place to live. What about you, Geoffrey?
Thank you. I agree with Tamara. I think my vision would be for a situation where the cities are the active champions for climate change mitigation and adaptation, because they have so many populations living within them. You can imagine if all the populations in all the global cities would agree that we really need to ensure that we manage the climate change issue, then that would be a very, very great result. Secondly, I think my vision is then how can we integrate the circular economy in the cities and how they manage their wastes. A lot of cities have ISOs of waste dump sites. They still practice open pit disposal, burning. Yet in the 21st century, we have a lot of very good innovative technologies that should actually be deployed to this area. It shouldn't be that we are still currently doing manual sorting of waste when there are technologies that can be able to do this. And secondly, and thirdly, then all this waste can effectively come back into the production chain, can provide more job opportunities to a lot of the local communities that rely sometimes directly from some of these wastes, but in a more sustainable manner. and thereby reduce the ecological footprint that we are having on society by not extracting more raw materials, as demonstrated by Tamara's presentation, but reusing some of this to ensure that we leave the world a better place. Quite ambitious, but that's my vision of how I would like this to work out in future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Geoffrey. Elba, do you have any closing remarks, or should we wrap up?
Thank you very much, everyone. So I think that in every project that we work related to smart cities, we think that, and it's the same for circular economy, we think that it's a journey. So it's making little steps or bigger steps. So beginning with something, some experimentation, or doing something like more at wider policy level. So I think that we can begin with something small and then go to something bigger. So it's, even if there's a lot to do, there's a lot that means that a lot can be done. So we can always begin with the small projects and then keep growing. So I would really like to thank you very much, Tamara and Geoffrey, for participating today in this webinar, the first webinar that we have organized. So sorry for to all the audience for the technical issues in the middle. We have checked that sometimes it's direct things that happen. And we really hope that it has been useful for all of you, and hope to meet you in the next webinars. Thank you, everyone, very much. Thank you, Tamara. Thank you, Geoffrey. And
yeah,
thank you.
Thanks for having me. And I shared my